In ancient Egypt, at this time of the year, it was on the 10th day of the month that the Israelites were instructed to put aside a lamb of the first year, one without blame, a male lamb without blemish, and keep it up until the 14th day and kill it in the evening. We'll talk about the meaning of that in just a few moments. But since today, I don't know if you're keeping up with your calendar, Hebrew calendars or not, today is the 10th day. Some of you obviously are. Today's the 10th day of the first month. Then I thought we would do a little preparation for what's coming up next week by reviewing some of the passages in the New Testament, as well as a few things out of the Old, concerning this season of the year, concerning the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So I'd like to begin in Matthew chapter 26. Matthew chapter 26, if you would turn there with me, please. And I want us to notice some terms that are used here, because these are not necessarily the same terms. They are the same terms, but they seem to be used differently than we find them being used in the Old Testament. And for that reason, some people become very confused over these things. And as we shall see, I'm going to try to confuse you today by looking at what this one says, what the next one says, then finally what John says, and so on. But in chapter 26, book of Matthew, verse 17, we read this. Now on the first day of unleavened bread, the disciples came to Jesus saying, "Where will you have us prepare for you to eat the Passover?" Now wait a minute. When you go back to Exodus 12, and when you go back to Leviticus 23, you find the first day of unleavened bread discussed there. It is described. We find that the Passover is when? A date is given for the Passover. In the Old Testament, it says on the 14th day of the first month is the Lord's Passover. Now here they're preparing to eat the Passover, which occurs on the 14th day of the first month. And then we're told, Leviticus 23, look it up, on the 15th day is the Feast of Unleavened Bread. That's the first day, and then the 7th day. Those 2 days are high days. Now what on earth is going on here? How is it that it says on the first day of unleavened bread, they're getting ready to eat the Passover? Well, they've got it all wrong. Or maybe we have it all wrong. You see, the problem is that the language changed. The language evolved. I'll talk about that a little bit more later. But first I'd like to see what all the synoptic gospels say and then compare that with what John says. Go on over to Mark 14 and see if Mark adds anything to it. Mark 14. And let's look at how he words this. He may give us a little more help, maybe not, we'll see. Mark 14, look at verse 7. Then came the day of unleavened bread on which the Passover lamb had to be sacrificed. Wait a minute. Sacrificed on the day of unleavened bread? And Matthew says it was the first day of unleavened bread. How in the world do you get the sacrifice that's supposed to take place on the 14th, taking place on the 15th, if indeed 15th is the day of the first day of unleavened bread? So no help from Mark. Let's see if Luke gives us any help. Or does he see if he confuses us further? Go over to Luke 22. Luke 22. Or I'm sorry, I was just in Luke, wasn't I? I read Luke and I skipped right over Mark. Back to Mark, okay. See if Mark helps us then. And on the first, no help here. And on the first day of unleavened bread, there it is again, when they sacrificed the Passover. Why were they doing that? That's not what it says in Leviticus 23. In Exodus 12, I'm really getting confused now. His disciples said to him, "Where will you have us go prepare for you to eat the Passover?" Aren't they a little late? Well, let's see what John says. Let's see what John says. We have Matthew, Luke, and Mark. I got them those two backward, but nevertheless, we see what they said. Well, go with me to John the 13th chapter. Now, interestingly enough, he doesn't describe anything about what happened that night as far as the bread and the wine. But we read about the supper. We read about Judas Iscariot. This was the same supper, the same meal when Judas went out to betray him. And here it is described in John chapter 13, verse 1 says, "Now before the feast of the Passover." What? Wait a minute, we're already on the first day of unleavened bread back in the Synoptic Gospels, and they're getting ready to have the Passover. And now John says that this was before the feast of the Passover. If you read it, you see they're talking about the same event, the same night. How can this be? I am really confused now. Will somebody help me? I think some of you probably can, but maybe how many of you could help me if we did start going around the room here and explain this to me? Well, let's see if John explains a little bit further. It gives us any additional information here. Maybe I'm just misreading it. Let's go over to chapter 18. Chapter 18. Remember that Jesus has been with his disciples. He went out into the garden. We see all this teaching he gives them in 16, 17. Now we're in chapter 18. We see the betrayal and arrest of Jesus. Let's skip on over to verse 28. Then they, this is referring to the Jews, he's been before the high priest for questioning. And now then they're leading him. They're going to take him to Pontius Pilate. It says, then they, these Jews, led Jesus from the house of Caiaphas, that's the high priest, to the governor's headquarters. It was early morning. Now remember, this was before the feast of the Passover when the supper took place. Then the night of betrayal, the same night. Now it's over in the early morning. It says, they themselves, meaning these Jews that led him, that took him there, they themselves did not enter the governor's headquarters. They considered that would make them unclean, ceremonially unclean, so that they would not be defiled, but could eat the Passover. Aren't they a little bit late by now? You get the impression that, look, this is what they've been doing. It's what the disciples did, what Jesus did. Now then, they are they're going to take it later. And some people say, well, that's because they're so busy with this fake trial and all that stuff going on in trying to get rid of Jesus that they just haven't had time to eat the Passover, so they're going to go ahead and eat it later, but they don't want to go into the governor's place and be defiled, so they'll go ahead and eat it later that day. I don't know that anybody would have thought that you could do that, but nevertheless, that's what some people have explained. Let's see if John adds anything else. Go over to chapter 19. Chapter 19, see if he helps us in, let's say chapter 19, and let's look at verse 14 there. Now, keep in mind where we are. This is right before the crucifixion. He's before Pilate. Now it was, notice this, 14. Now it was the day of preparation of the Passover. Huh? The preparation of the Passover? It was about the 6th hour. He, meaning Pilate, said to the Jews, behold your king. Are you confused yet? And then he says further, look at verse 31. This is at the crucifixion, during the crucifixion. It says, since it was the day of the preparation of what? Well, he just said the preparation of the Passover. Here he's being crucified on the day of the preparation of the Passover, and yet it seems that the day before, the night before, whenever it was, Jesus and his disciples had the Passover. So what's going on here? And even said it was on the first day of unleavened bread. Now then, John is just now getting there. So since it was the day of the preparation, and so that the bodies would not remain on the cross on the Sabbath, what Sabbath would that be? For that Sabbath was a high day. It's a high day Sabbath. That would be the 15th right there, wouldn't it? So the 14th is the day of preparation, and here the others were calling that the first day of unleavened bread. Are you confused yet? Of course, some of us have been through this over and over and over again, going all the way back to the early 80s in my case. So it's not really confusing once you understand a few basic things. And that is that natural, normal etymology always occurs in every language, especially when you have translation from one language to another and people living from one culture or within one culture after another. In the case of the Jews, they had been subjected to everybody from the Babylonians down to the Romans. And now that the language has evolved. And the words that were used originally back in the time of Moses have kind of expanded and changed in meaning. We see that all the time, don't we? It happens in our own languages. That's why that English is considered a living language, whereas Latin is considered a dead language because it's not in use anymore, at least the old Latin. And so it's stable. It stays the same all the time. You see that with certain languages that have fallen into disuse. But most languages that are in use do change over time. You know, the rules of grammar are always changing, and the use of terms are always changing. We read in Antiquities of the Jews, Josephus, in his book Antiquities of the Jews, 2:15:1, if you want a reference, second book, 15th chapter, first paragraph. In Antiquities of the Jews, we read that the Feast of Unleavened Bread was known by this time as a feast of 8 days. You see, they counted the 14th as the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. The 15th was the first high day. But that 14th, the day of that John calls the preparation of the Passover, was also included in the days of unleavened bread. And the whole feast was called, guess what? Passover. Not just that one day on that one thing that happened on the 14th, which we'll talk about in a few moments, but also the whole feast was referred to as the Passover festival. And even today we speak of the approaching Passover season, don't we? The Passover season is at the door, as it were. It's approaching rapidly. So we know next week that we'll be in the Passover season. So that's the way languages change, and it explains a lot here. So then when you go back now, let's go back to Matthew. Before we do that, we'll go back to Matthew 26 in a few minutes and look at some other things there. But before we do that, I'd like to talk about a controversy that often comes up concerning when the Passover, anciently, when it actually occurred. And we'll see that what we see here both in the Synoptic Gospels and in the book of John, given the evolution of language, that it is consistent with what is revealed in the Old Testament. I want to point out that there is no such thing as a domestic Passover. Have you ever heard of that? Domestic Passover versus sanctuary-centered Passover. You see, the argument is that the kings of Israel in the time of Hezekiah and Josiah are the ones who invented the sanctuary-centered Passover. And if you go back and read the account of Josiah especially, the great Passover that he had, and all these massive numbers of animals, it tells you how many lambs, how many of the other sacrifices were brought to the sanctuary and killed and offered by the priests there. And it says that they worked diligently in offering. There's so many animals to offer all the way to nightfall. Wait a minute. That means they were offering during the daylight hours, doesn't it? And then everybody acknowledges, well, yeah, but you see, they kind of changed things by then. They made it into a sanctuary-centered sacrifice in order to keep the people under control, because this was kind of a rebellious people, and they'd been so far away. They hadn't done this in a long time. So in order to keep them under control, they kind of come up with this new way of keeping it. So yeah, it's admitted that it was offered in the 14th, the daylight hours of the 14th, and then eaten that night in the 15th. And this is where the Jewish custom comes from. But it is said it started there. The problem is, when you look at that text, we won't take the time to go there, it says what they did was according to the law. Now, was it according to the law or not? The text says it was according to what Moses had written. Now, the question is, what did Moses write concerning a domestic versus sanctuary-centered Passover? Domestic Passover means Passover just as it was done in Egypt. You see, the idea is that it was supposed to always be done that way. That wherever you lived, I suppose, only later you had to come to Jerusalem, but wherever you were in Jerusalem, you took your lamb, you killed it, I guess outside your tent or whatever you were living in, and you told your kids the Passover story, what happened in Egypt and all of that, and then you ate the lamb right there. That's a domestic Passover. In other words, you didn't take the blood to the temple. Well, is that the way God intended for the Passover to be kept? Or is that an invention of the later kings of the restoration period? Well, look at Numbers. We see the answer in Numbers chapter 9. And this is where we come up with the idea of a second Passover for those who, for some reason, were unable to keep the first. On the 14th day of the first month, in the evening. We're unable to keep it then, and you'll see why in this chapter. But there's something else. I don't want to focus on the second Passover. What I do want to focus on is the language that's used here, and it becomes very clear what he is talking about. Numbers 9 says, "And the Lord spoke to Moses," verse 1, "in the wilderness of Sinai in the first month of the second year after they had come out of the land of Egypt." So they're out of Egypt now, second year, and something's about to happen here. Let me give you some context first. If you go back and read the preceding chapters, you see the tabernacle has been erected. The furnishings of the tabernacle are in place. The priesthood has been sanctified. The Levites have been set apart to do their task. So they're ready to begin worshiping God at the tabernacle. This was the sanctuary. It was a portable sanctuary because they were in the wilderness. They were not in the land of promise yet. They weren't settled there yet. So it goes on to say, "Let the people of Israel keep the Passover at its appointed time." This is verse 2. And when are they going to do it? It says, "On the 14th day of the month at twilight." This translation says twilight, but the word in Hebrew is Ben ha-arbaim. What does it mean? It means between the evenings. Now, what does that mean? Well, there are different explanations for it, different interpretations of it. Some believe, and I actually asked Ben Sadaka, who is the head of the, I guess, some kind of publication society with the Samaritans. Actually, the Samaritans, descendants of those ancient Samaritans that were there, they're still there. They still keep the Passover in Mount Gerizim and all of that. So I asked him what was the meaning, what did he think the meaning of this was? And he said it's between the sunsets. Okay, that kind of makes sense. On the 14th day, between the evenings, you have an evening that begins the day and an evening that ends the day. So that's a possibility. But you have others in our old tradition, going way back, 60s, 70s, and so on, always said, no, it's the twilight, the beginning of the 14th, that little narrow window of time from sunset till dark that begins the 14th. So whatever this means to keep the Passover had to be done within that period. The killing of the lamb, in other words, had to be done within that period, and all that you did with it after you killed it. So this was the idea. Now there's another view, and that is the one held by the Jews during the time of Jesus and before, when the temple was standing, and that is that between the evenings meant from about noon until sunset. So it's the latter part of the day, not the beginning of the day, but the latter part of the day. Now, the Samaritans, interestingly enough, when you look at how they practice that, they believe it's from sunset to sunset, but say, okay, so when do you offer the sacrifice of the lambs? They said, right about sunset as the day ends. So they do it basically like the Jews. Now, their calendar is different from the Jewish calendar, and sometimes the 14th falls on a Friday. Guess what they do then? Because they don't want to have all that work going on into the Sabbath, because there's a lot of work. You're killing lambs and roasting them. It takes several hours of work to do all this. This is not something you do in 5 minutes. Say, dinner's on. No, this is sometimes several hours, maybe up to 5 hours to get all of this done. So you don't want to wait till the last minute unless you plan to work into the night, which that's what the Samaritans normally do. But what they do on Friday, because they want to prevent all this work on the Sabbath, is they back it up to noon. Give them plenty of time to get all that work done. But they never do it at the beginning of the 14th. And nobody else I know of does either, and I can't find any record that anybody in history ever did it that way. So you have those three ideas there. And to me, in my opinion, the weakest one of all is that it represents twilight at the beginning of the day. And I'll tell you why that's weak right here in this chapter. Why that can't be so. No way that can be true. And that is, this chapter, as we shall see, shows us that God had in view from the beginning a sanctuary-centered Passover sacrifice. This is after Egypt, of course. They had no sanctuary in Egypt. That was different. That was the original event. It was not to be done the same way year after year afterward, but it was to be done at the sanctuary. And here you see evidence of that right here in this chapter. Let's notice what it says. It goes on to say, verse 5, "And they kept the Passover In the first month, on the 14th day of the month, Ben Ha-Arbim, between the evenings, in the wilderness of Sinai, according to all that the Lord commanded Moses, so the people of Israel did. Now hold your place right here. Go back to Exodus 12 and let's see exactly what they did during this time called Ben Ha-Arbim, which occurred on the 14th. In Exodus chapter 12, you see the instructions concerning the Passover, beginning in verse 5, says, "Your lamb shall be without blemish, a male a year old. You may take it from the sheep or from the goats, and you shall keep it," meaning the lamb, "until the 14th day of the month. Then the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel shall kill their lambs Ben Ha-Arbim." So what happens at Ben Ha-Arbim, or between the evenings on the 14th? The killing of the lamb. Okay? Any question about that? No, that's when it occurs. The killing of the lambs took place Ben Ha-Arbim on the 14th, between the evenings. Then they shall take some of the blood and put it on the doorposts and the lintels of the houses in which they eat it. They shall eat the flesh that night. Now, if Ben Ha-Arbim represents that first narrow window of time at twilight at the beginning of the 14th, then that night would be the night portion of the 14th. But if it represents the latter part of the 14th, as the Jews believed in the time of Jesus, and as the Samaritans include in their definition of it, then that night would mean the night portion of the 15th, wouldn't it? So which is it? Back to Numbers 9 now. We'll see some evidence here. Back to Numbers 9. It says in verse 6, "And there were certain men who were unclean through touching a dead body, so that they could not keep the Passover on that day. And they came before Moses and Aaron on that day. And those men said to him, 'We are unclean through touching a dead body,'" that's ceremonially unclean, ritually unclean. "Why were we," now notice the language, "why were we kept from bringing the Lord's offering?" What do you mean, bringing the Lord's offering? I thought you just took it out there and killed it next to your tent. Nobody else's business. What do you mean somebody prevented them from bringing the Lord's offering? It meant that they were forbidden from bringing it to the blood to that altar at the sanctuary. That's what happened here. This is not the language of a domestic Passover. This is the language of a sanctuary-centered Passover. Read it in its context. Read the previous chapters. You see the setting up of the tabernacle, the construction of the sanctuary itself, the setting apart of the priesthood, and so on. Then it goes on. And then Moses gives the instructions on what they're to do. Then people in that category, if they're out of town or if they're unclean by reason of a dead body or something like that, then they have an excuse, or a reasonable excuse, and therefore they can do this in the second month. And then he says, let's just skip over a portion of this, go down to verse 13. "But if anyone who is clean and is not on a journey fails to keep the Passover, that person shall be cut off from his people, because he did not," get this, "bring the Lord's offering." Where do you bring it to? It's obvious, isn't it? To the sanctuary. The blood is dashed on that altar like other sacrifices. At its appointed time, that man shall bear his sin. So this is evidence right here that God intended from the beginning that the Passover sacrifice would be a sanctuary-centered Passover. Now, why is that important? Well, for one very important reason. What does that have to do with the idea that it can't be that narrow window of time at the beginning of the 14th? The reason is this. God says, if you obey my law, if you keep my covenant, if you remain faithful, I will cause you to multiply in the land. I will bless the fruit of your womb and the fruit of your vine and all of your agricultural produce and your cattle and your livestock. In other words, that grow into a big and great nation, great multitude of people. And that would mean then that in time, how many sacrifices would be brought to that one altar? Do you think 1,000,000 lambs could be brought to that one altar in that narrow window of time, and all that blood the job gets done in that little narrow window of time? I don't think so. Well, 2 million. According to Josephus, and he might have been exaggerating, we don't know, He claims that 1,000,000 lambs were being brought in his time, or in the Second Temple period. That as many as 1,000,000 were brought to the temple. And they had a system of doing it. They had the priests lined up. And they brought in the blood, and it was just constantly dashing against the altar. You know, the blood. Some people offered that themselves, but they still had to bring the blood there. And in some cases, the priest would offer the sacrifice. In the time of Josiah, you see the priests were offering all the sacrifices. But the point is that was a sanctuary-centered sacrifice like the other sacrifices. It was not to be offered wherever you were out there, just as long as it was somewhere in Jerusalem. But it was to be offered at the sanctuary. And you've got to have some time to do that, don't you? So therefore, it makes sense that Ben Ha-Arbiyim would refer to a broader period of time than merely that little window at the beginning of the 14th. So that's why I say that the original Passover occurred in the daylight hour, that is the killing of the lambs, and in other words, the sacrificial rite began in the daylight hours of the 14th. And it was actually going on, or would have been going on if the temple hadn't been defiled, or maybe it was already going on, at the time Jesus died. He died on what day? The 14th. The day of preparation, as John tells us. The day of preparation of the Passover. His death took place then, as the Passover lambs were normally being killed. Now that's fitting symbolism there, isn't it? So, that's a major reason right there for my understanding of this, is because it's very clear that God intended the sanctuary-centered sacrifice to occur after Egypt, and it's not something that was added way later. God Himself instituted that. So now, with all that in mind, let's go back to Matthew 26 and re-examine this. Matthew 26, this time we're going to go a little further into the story and take a look at let's begin there in verse 26. It says, "Now as they were eating, Jesus took bread, and after blessing it, broke it, and gave it to the disciples, and said, 'Take, eat, this is my body.' And He took a cup, and when He had given thanks, He gave it to them, saying, 'Drink of it, all of you, for this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins.'" Now, I want to focus on this expression, the blood of the covenant. And by the way, that's the title of the sermon, Blood of the Covenant. So He says, "This is my blood of the covenant," meaning this symbol. I don't believe that He's teaching transubstantiation here. He's just saying this symbolizes, what I'm giving you here, this symbolizes my blood, which is the blood of the covenant. Now, where does that language come from? Well, I will get to that in just a few moments, but let's look at Luke's account of that. We'll skip over Mark, go straight on over to Luke. And look, Mark says essentially the same thing, but in Luke 22, and we want to look at, in this case, we want to look at verse 14, begin in verse 14. "And when the hour came, He reclined at table, and the apostles with Him, and He said to them, 'I have earnestly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer.'" Now, this is interesting the way this is worded, especially in this translation, and I think it accurately reflects the Greek. He says, "For I tell you, I will not eat it until it is fulfilled in the kingdom of God." I wonder what he's talking about. I'll present a possibility. This is not dogmatic, but it very well could be that he's talking about what would have normally been done on the next night. "I have earnestly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer." In other words, I would have this cup passed from me, and let me have another year so I could have this Passover with you. He says, "For I tell you, I will not eat it." It could mean that he said, "I'm not going to eat it because I'm going to be suffering. I'll be on the cross or the stake, whatever you want to call it." He said, "I tell you, I will not eat it until it is fulfilled in the kingdom of God." On the other hand, he could simply be referring to the meal they were having that night. Now, let me ask you the question, why do you think they would call that the Passover when we know the Passover was not eaten until the next night? Why would they call this Passover? He says, with desire, I've desired to eat this Passover with you. In the other accounts, in Matthew's account, they call it Passover. Where would you have us prepare the Passover? And so it could be that they had in mind, no doubt they did, they were thinking in terms of the whole festivity, what they were going to do that night as well as tomorrow night. But it seems that he's referring to that meal they had that night as Passover. Well, some people said, well, they had an early Passover. The problem I have with that is, let me see if I can find it right quick. Let me look back to Matthew. In one of the accounts, he says, I don't remember which one, but one of the accounts he says here it is. Back in Matthew's account, chapter 26 again, and verse 18, he said, "Go." This is when they said, "Where will you have us prepare to eat the Passover?" Verse 18 says, he said, "Go into a certain city, and a certain man to say to him, the teacher says, my time is at hand. I will keep the Passover at your house with my disciples." And the disciples did as Jesus had directed, and they prepared the Passover. Okay, now here again, you got to wonder how much time they had, but this is what's interesting. Verse 20 it says, when it was evening. Wait a minute, it wasn't already evening? When it was evening, he reclined at table with the 12. So they had this Passover meal. He sensed his disciples. It says it was the first day of unleavened bread, which means it was the 14th. But this gives you some clue as to when on the 14th it was. It must have been right at the very beginning, during that twilight period, right at the beginning of the 14th, when they say, where are we going to eat the Passover? I mean, if they were planning on going killing the lamb right then, it's a little bit late to be asking that, isn't it? Oh, by the way, hey, it's sundown. Where are we going to eat the Passover? Oh, you better go get a lamb. Oh, you got to kill it. It's going to take several hours. But yet it says when it was evening, he reclined at the table. He came later after they prepared the place. He came, and it was evening when he came. And it doesn't seem that they had time to prepare a meal, does it? There's something else that's missing here. If you think about it, you'll realize what it is. What was the custom in the ancient Passover? Or as far as that goes in the time of Jesus, the Passover. You remember Mary and Joseph went to Jerusalem every year at the Passover? They took Jesus with them. The one time they ran off and left him, they assumed he was with them and found out, oh no, he's still back there. So they went back and found him in the temple. Well, they had been at the Feast of the Passover. You know, this was a family occasion. Where's the family? Where are the families? So this was the night before the normal Passover meal was eaten. And yet they seem to be calling this Passover. Why is that? Well, if you understand that all 8 days were considered the Passover feast, then that meal that would begin the festival, that took place right at the beginning of the festival, not the Passover lamb, but the meal, would be considered a Passover or seasonal meal, wouldn't it? So I would say that's the most likely answer. This was a Passover meal, but it wasn't the lamb. The lamb would normally be done the next night. Okay, so that's a perfectly logical explanation, at least in my mind. Some say, no, it was an early Passover. Still, you have the same problem. You don't have a lot of time there to be doing all this. But in any case, and I know some people can reason and say, well, it was a small enough lamb, it didn't take long to cook it, and blah, blah, blah. There are people who offered reasons, but I think the most logical explanation there is that they had a seasonal meal. It was a part of the Passover, this 8-day festival called Passover, part of the Passover festival. Therefore, it was a Passover meal, but it was not the sacrificed lamb. That's my opinion. Now, with that in mind, not sure where we got to in Luke, if we were going to go any further in Luke, but let's go back to Luke there. We could stay in Matthew, but since I've already turned back to Luke, I'll just read from this in read from verse 14. We began in verse 14, got down to verse 16, I think. So verse 17, and he took the cup, and when he had given thanks, he said, take this and divide it among yourselves. For I tell you that from now on I will not drink of the fruit of the vine until the kingdom of God comes. And he took the bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and gave it to them, saying, This is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me. So he's instituting something new, isn't he? Do this in remembrance of me. No, he's not merely changing the symbols, as some people have said. Changing the symbols of the Passover. No, he's instituting something brand new. You see, the Passover was a sacrificial rite under the Old Covenant. It pointed forward to the coming of Jesus Christ and to his sacrifice. What he's instituting here is a memorial. It now looks back at that sacrifice. It's different. It's not the same thing. Oh, it is rooted in Passover, no question about that, but it's not the same as the statutory Passover you read about in Leviticus 23 or Exodus 12. So when he had given thanks, he broke it and gave it to them, said, Take, eat, this is my body, it's given for you, do this in remembrance of me. And likewise the cup, which they had, after they had eaten, saying, This cup that is poured out for you is the new covenant in my blood. Now the way it's put in Matthew, as we read it a little while ago, he says, Drink of it, all of you, for this is my blood of the covenant. I ask you, what is he referring to here? He's not referring back to the Passover sacrifice. He's referring back to a different sacrifice. Now, in the booklet that Johnny mentioned, Why Do We Keep the Lord's Supper in the Early Hours of the 14th, with Lord's Supper in quotation marks, all this is covered in there. And that is what he institutes this night draws from the true meaning of not only the Passover sacrifice itself, but also, as we shall see, from the peace offerings, from the burnt offerings, and every other offering that was offered under the Old Testament, under the Levitical priesthood. All those sacrifices pointed to, this one memorial service encompasses, it takes in all of that. So not only is this a New Testament Passover, it's also a New Testament peace offering, a New Testament burnt offering. It is also a New Testament sin offering, as it were, because it symbolizes the once-for-all sacrifice that permanently and completely takes away sins. Now let's go back and see exactly what Jesus was drawing from in the Old Testament. Go back to Exodus 24. Exodus 24. First of all, we'll kind of give you a little context. Remember, the children of Israel had come out of Egypt. Now they were at Mount Sinai, and this most momentous event, this incredible, mind-blowing event takes place when God himself comes down on the mountain. And of course, they were scared to death because of all the thundering, the lightning, the shaking of the earth, everything that was going on. We say that right away, he gives them the 10 Commandments, which is, he gives these right up front because this is the basic moral law. This is the moral law upon which everything else is built or hangs. Jesus said the 2 great commandments, love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, and soul, love your neighbor as yourself. That all the law and the prophets hang on those 2. Well, this is those 2 commandments broken down into 10 moral categories. So very important that they're placed right up front and also written on tablets of stone. Then you have all these other laws. Now the people, if you compare the Deuteronomy account, the people objected. They said, Moses, we're scared to death. Oh, we're afraid he's going to kill us. We're afraid we're going to die. Even a beast goes near the mountain, touches the mountain, it's going to die. And the people were told to stand back, don't come near, lest you die. They were scared. So we probably would be too, with all the shaking of the earth and the thundering and lightning and all of that. And it says, you talk to us, Moses. And so here you have all these laws concerning altars and servitude and restitution and social justice and Sabbaths and festivals and all these other things. This is the law of the covenant, a summation of the law of the covenant. Now once that summary of the law of the covenant was given, Let's just take up the account there in chapter 24, Exodus 24, and we'll begin right there in verse 1. Then he said to Moses, "Come up to the Lord, you and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, and 70 of the elders of Israel, and worship from afar." In other words, come up here, but don't let everybody get too close. "Moses alone shall come near to the Lord, but the others shall not come near, and the people shall not come up with him." They're to stay back. They're to stay down there. Keep them off the mountain. Moses came and told the people all the words of the Lord and all the rules, and all the people answered with one voice and said, "All the words that the Lord has spoken, we will do." This is in the process of ratifying the covenant that God is establishing with them. He's given His law, the basic moral law included and contained in 10 commandments, and now then these other laws pertaining to the covenant and other things they were to do. It says, "And Moses wrote down all the words of the Lord. He rose early in the morning and built an altar at the foot of the mountain and 12 pillars according to the 12 tribes of Israel. And he sent young men of the people of Israel who offered burnt offerings and sacrificed peace offerings of oxen to the Lord." So these are the kinds of offerings that were being offered there. This was not the tabernacle, understand. This was a special offering that was going to be used in ratifying the covenant. So burnt offerings and peace offerings were offered to the Lord there on that particular altar. "And Moses took half of the blood and put it in the basins, and half the blood he threw against the altar that was built for this special purpose. Then he took the book of the covenant." This is what he had written, and we have a summary of it right here. "Took the book of the covenant and read it in the hearing of the people." And here's what they said: "All that the Lord has spoken, we will do, and we will be obedient." So they're agreeing to the terms of the covenant. "And Moses took the blood and threw it on the people and said, 'Behold the blood of the covenant that the Lord has made with you in accordance with all these words.'" This is what Jesus was quoting. Behold the blood of the covenant. Only he's applying it to a different covenant. It says, Luke's account tells us, it's the blood of the new covenant. So he's drawing from this. And what this means, the reason they did this is, understand, first of all, this is not the Passover. This is not the Passover sacrifice. These are peace offerings and burnt offerings, and the blood of the covenant is used. It is sprinkled on the people in order to cleanse them from their sins. And why is that important? Because they're entering into the covenant. They're entering into covenant. They must be cleansed. They must be purified to enter into the covenant. So Moses sprinkles it, and first off, some on the altar and then on the people. And this symbolizes their cleansing, cleansed by the blood, as it were. And so this is what went on there. This was the purpose of sprinkling the blood on the people. And again, Moses says, "This is the blood of the covenant." Same thing Jesus said in the night of his betrayal when he gave the disciples the bread and the wine. I call that to your attention because I want you to understand that what we do on that night is more than merely the reiteration of, or it draws not only from the Passover, it does that to be sure. You see the connection with the Passover. But it also draws from the other sacrifices that were offered in the Old Testament. And all that they meant then, all that they pointed to, when we take the bread and the wine, then what we're doing, we're recommitting ourselves to the covenant we made. It was ratified at our baptism, and we're recognizing and acknowledging and once again recommitting ourselves to this once for all sacrifice, which accomplishes everything all those Old Testament Passover, or all those Old Testament sacrifices pointed to, including Passover, but not exclusively the Passover. So that's why I say the commemoration of Christ's death is linked not only to the Passover, but to the covenant ratifying sacrifice and every other sacrifice in the sacrificial system under the Levitical system. So it's much more than just, this is our new covenant Passover. It is that. I don't have any problem calling it the New Testament Passover. But it's also a New Testament sin offering in a sense, a New Testament peace offering. It's a New Testament burnt offering and every other offering you can name. It encompasses the meaning of all of those things. Now, with that in mind, let's go to, since we're talking about the new covenant, since Jesus says, "This is my blood of the new covenant," let's go to Jeremiah 31 and see what that says. See if we can unpack a little bit of that concerning the new covenant. Jeremiah 31, and beginning in verse 31, very familiar scripture here, says, "Behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah." Now, we always put this in the future, and certainly I do believe that it does apply to the future, but more than that, as we see from what Jesus himself said, the blood of that covenant has already been shed, and it's already being applied to lives right now, as it was in the first century. So he mentions the house of Israel and the house of Judah. Gentiles are not mentioned here, and yet they are in other passages. And we know the reason he mentions the house of Israel and the house of Judah here, he wants to emphasize the fullness of the people of God. This is for all the people of God. And you see other passages that you could link to this to show that this is not exclusively for Israel, but it's also for Gentiles as well, as you see made very plain in the New Testament. Verse 32, "It's not like the covenant that I made with their fathers." We saw what that was like, didn't we? You know what happened then? They said, "All the Lord has said we will do." The covenant was ratified with blood, and they were cleansed with the sprinkling of the blood, and they had agreed to what the Lord had said concerning the terms of the covenant. They said, "Yes, we will do it." Did they? Did they? How far did they get before they were already turning to idolatry? Not very far. But anyway, he says, this is going to be different. This is going to be different. It says, "Not like the covenant that I made with their fathers on the day when I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt, my covenant that they broke, though I was their husband, declares the Lord." He's using this analogy here, describing himself as the husband. He's the husband, they're the bride. The nation of Israel is the bride. And what is meant here, of course, is that the husband has responsibility to take care of the wife's needs. And the terms of the covenant spelled it all out. That's exactly what he intended to do. Your job is to be faithful. As the faithful wife, you be faithful to the covenant, to the terms of the covenant, and I will provide for you. I'll see to it that your needs are met, and I'll be like the faithful, loving husband. So it's a comparison being made here. But of course, when she became unfaithful, then that broke the covenant, didn't it? You have a problem. The problem was not with the terms of the covenant. The problem was with the people. Their unfaithfulness to keep those terms. It says, "But this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, declares the Lord." Here's the difference right here. Here it is. "I will put my law within them." Isn't that what he wanted from the beginning? Why wasn't his law within them before? Because of their hardness of heart. They could have had that, but no, it wasn't to be because of their hardness of heart, because of their rebellious spirit. "I will put my law within them, and I will write it on their hearts." And this, of course, we understand when we look at all that the Scripture says about this, that this involves the activity of the Spirit of God working in the hearts of individuals, enabling and helping people to do just that. "I will put my law within them, I will write it on their hearts, I will be their God, and they shall be my people. And no longer shall each one teach his neighbor and each his brother, saying, 'Know the Lord,' for they will all know him." In other words, it's going to be universal at that time. To the time this comes to its fullness, the fullness of its meaning, it will be universal. "From the least of them to the greatest, declares the Lord, for I will forgive their iniquity, and I will remember their sin no more." So what you have here is the difference between the old and the new It's not a difference in the law. You know, when it says, I will write my law on their inward parts, on their hearts, it's not some different law. He's not saying, I will write my 9 commandments. No, it's the law. We've done this before, but if you go back through Jeremiah and read all of God's statements about my law, where he says, my law, my law, my law. We found, some of you may remember when we did that, we saw many references that God makes to, quote, my law. And it is clear which law he's talking about. It's not some new, different law, but it's the same law, but this one is now written in the hearts and on the minds. It's internalized and not merely left on tables of stone. It's internalized. And the true intent of it now is understood because the Spirit of God is operating in the lives of people who have entered into this new covenant. So that's the difference between the old and the new. Now, with all of that in mind, let's go over to Hebrews chapter 12, and we'll conclude with this one. Hebrews chapter 12. And this is after he's warned in several places of the possibility of apostasy. He mentions it again here, even though he has all this encouraging language. But he is warned about apostasy. And we're going to see in this that he describes God in a certain way that I find to be quite interesting. But listen to what he says about the new covenant. Verse 18, for you have not come to what may be touched, a blazing fire and darkness and gloom and a tempest. He's talking about Mount Sinai. And the sound of a trumpet and a voice whose words made the hearers beg that no further messages be spoken to them. You speak to us, Moses. Don't let him speak. We'll die. For they could not endure the order that was given. If even a beast touches the mountain, it shall be stoned. Indeed, so terrifying was the sight that Moses said, I tremble with fear. But you have come to Mount Zion. This is the mountain you've come to, and you who are under the new covenant. You have come to Mount Zion and to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, and to innumerable angels in festal gathering. That's a very different scene, isn't it? Not one of fearfulness and terror. And to the assembly of the firstborn who are enrolled in heaven, and to God, the judge of all, and to the spirits of the righteous made perfect, and to Jesus, the mediator of a new covenant, and to the sprinkled blood that speaks better words than the blood of Abel. What he's referring to here is the fact that God told Cain, your brother's blood, the brother that Cain had killed, Abel, your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. But this is a sprinkled blood that speaks of better things, not crying for vengeance, but one that brings about salvation. See that you do not refuse him who is speaking, as they did back at Mount Sinai. You talk to us, Moses. We're afraid of him. For if they did not escape when they refused him who warned them on earth, much less will we escape. Now there's a warning associated with this. Though we have come to Mount Zion, to the living of the city of the living God, though we have come to this innumerable company of angels, to the assembly of the firstborn, all this good things, very different from the old, what happened back there in the old covenant. We come with faith, because he just has in chapter 11, he's described faith. So we come to Mount Zion with faith, but there's still a warning here, something we need to take to heart and remember during this season of the year. For if they did not escape when they refused him who warned them on earth, much less will we escape if we reject him who warns from heaven. At that time his voice shook the earth, and now he has promised, yet once more I will shake not only the earth, but also the heavens. In other words, there's a worse shaking going to be going on. There's a whole lot of shaking going on. There will be much worse to take place than happened back then. In other words, he's talking about the ultimate and final day of the Lord. And the judgment, the final judgment as well. This phrase, yet once more, indicates that the removal of things that are shaken, that is, things that have been made, in order that the things that cannot be shaken may remain. So this is a time of judgment, a time of sifting he's talking about, when those who are unshakable will not be shaken. So he's telling, this is a warning to the people. Therefore, let us be grateful for receiving a kingdom that cannot be shaken, and thus let us offer to God acceptable worship with reverence and awe, for our God is a consuming fire. He's referring back to Deuteronomy 4 and verse 24. So even though you have all this good news of the new covenant, even though the law is written in our hearts, in our minds, it's been internalized, and we have the help that we need to live within the terms of the covenant and to be faithful to God, nevertheless, it is possible that if we so choose, we can walk away from it. If we so choose, we can allow the Babylon that we're in the midst of to begin to influence us, and we can begin to lose interest in and turn away from the God who has called us to this new covenant and who has redeemed us through the blood, the shed blood of Jesus Christ, and we can apostatize and ultimately walk away from it. And for us then, if we fall in that category, then our God is a consuming fire. We don't want to be shaken. We don't want to be shaken and to dissolve away with all that dissolves away in that great day of shaking, that great day of the Lord. We want to be unshakable. So we're called to be faithful. Faithful to the truth that we understand, faithful to the covenant in which God has placed us through the shed blood of Jesus Christ. And you know, it's interesting that you see all this controversy in Paul's epistles, especially concerning the law. And yet, if you understand this very simple principle here, that our God is a consuming fire, but He's only a consuming fire to those who are in rebellion. You read 1 John, we won't take the time to go over there, but a couple of times, different places, he tells us that God is love. So how is this? God is love, and yet God is a consuming fire? Well, to those who are in covenant relationship with God, who remain faithful to Him, those who have been redeemed by the blood of the Lamb, and who embrace it and are unshakable therefore, because they have embraced this unshakable kingdom and this unshakable relationship, well, to them, God is love. God is love. But to those who rebel, those who apostatize, those who turn aside, who go after other gods, as the Israelites did in the wilderness, who turn away and abandon God and His way, then to them, God is a consuming fire. If you understand the Apostle Paul's comments about the law, if you understand that concept, then you can understand what Paul is talking about when sometimes he seems to be speaking very positively about the law. The law is holy, the law is just and good, the law is spiritual. He talks about keeping the law of God in the inner man and all of that. And it's in glow. You could list all the scriptures where he says positive things about the law, and it's put it in glowing terms almost. You know, to those who are in covenant relationship and are faithful to that covenant, then the law to them is as a law of spirit and life, the law of the spirit of life. But for those who rebel, those who apostatize, who turn away from the God who has been so gracious to them, it becomes for them a law of sin and death. And so it is. It's just the way it is. If you understand this basic principle here, then you understand all of Paul's difficult statements about the law. You should be able to understand it from that perspective. He's talking about different functions of the law, and the law, its function regarding those who are faithful and those who are unfaithful. It's as simple as that. But for us, as we approach this season, as we prepare next week to take the bread and the wine, to stoop down and wash one another's feet, hopefully in humility, that we're reminded that we're called to a life of faithfulness, regardless what we see going on in the world, regardless what hardships may lie along life's path. We're called to that law, we're called to that life of faithfulness, and we're given a kingdom that is unshakable. So let's cling to it, hold fast to it, and let this Passover season be a reminder to us to continue faithfully following Jesus Christ.